The stadium was a living storm of sound, as thousands of voices blended into one endless roar. Flags rippled in the wind high above, and sunlight spilled down in golden sheets across the sea of people. In every direction, cameras flashed, and the distant rumble of drums echoed from the far side of the field, but in the middle of the VIP row there was a stillness that did not belong, a stillness that drew the eyes without meaning to. It was the way he sat, the way he occupied the space without moving, yet without shrinking into it. Either a black Marine dressed in a pressed jacket that carried the weight of history on its shoulders, every patch, every stripe, every subtle thread told stories. Most in the crowd would never understand his posture. Was upright, his gaze cutting through the noise, scanning faces as though searching for someone or something, and there was an intensity to that search, like a man who had learned to notice small things and trust them completely. Around him, the VIP row was filled with polished suits, crisp dresses, rows of ribbons and medals pinned to the chests of decorated guests and political figures, their laughter drifting in short bursts as they chatted and sipped from crystal glasses. A few of them glanced at him and then quickly looked away, perhaps curious, perhaps unsure why someone like him was there without a visible companion. He was alone in his section, but he did not seem out of place. His presence had a gravity to it, and the people nearby felt it, even if they did not admit it to themselves. The announcer's voice boomed through the speakers as names were read off the list of honored guests and dignitaries. The crowd responded with applause at each one, but the Marine barely seemed to hear it. His eyes continued their slow, measured sweep of the arena, the way a soldier surveys a battlefield, noting vantage points, exits, possible threats. His breathing was steady, his face unreadable, though every line in it carried the marks of a man who had seen and endured more than most people could imagine. There was no arrogance in him, and no fear either. Only the calm focus of someone who understood his own strength and knew when to use it. The rows behind him were full of curious strangers. Some were veterans themselves who recognized the way he held himself, and they regarded him with quiet respect. Others were simply attendees enjoying the event, unaware that anything out of the ordinary might happen. But in the air there was a faint electric tension, like the moment before a lightning strike, the kind that only a few people noticed, and those few kept glancing back at the Marine as if waiting for something to happen. From the corner of his vision, he could see the slow approach of movement along the aisle. Two figures in press security uniforms walking with the deliberate stride of people who were not wandering, but heading toward a target. The Marine did not turn to look at them. He had already seen them. The instant they entered the section, his mind had filed them away. Their pace, their angle, their body language, and something in the way they carried themselves told him they were not coming to offer a handshake. The wind shifted, carrying the faint sound of their radios clipped to their belts, the murmur of static and a burst of words too quiet for most to hear, but clear enough for the Marine to know they were talking about him. The two continued to close the distance, weaving between rows, their expressions set in stone. They did not break stride when someone tried to greet them. They simply nodded curtly and kept moving like men on a timed mission. The Marine shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his boots planted firmly on the ground, his shoulders squared just slightly, not in defiance but in readiness. There was no visible reaction, no raised eyebrow, no clenched jaw. Yet something in his stillness seemed to make the air heavier for those who were close enough to feel. It was not a posture that begged for trouble. It was one that warned trouble. It might not end the way it expected. All around the stadium, the ceremony continued. Flags waved, music played, people laughed and clapped. Yet in this small stretch of the VIP section, a separate scene was unfolding, like a slow burn hidden from the thousands who were too far to notice. The guards drew closer now, just a few steps away, their eyes narrowing ever so slightly as they looked down at the Marine, their Footsteps stopped directly beside him. One of them glanced at the clipboard in his hand as if confirming a name or a seat number, then back at the Marine. The Marine did not look up. His gaze remained fixed straight ahead, his breathing unbroken, his hands resting palm down on his knees, his body a statue carved from the will of someone who had been tested in harsher places than this. He could feel their presence beside him, the faint shift of their weight, the sound of one of them adjusting, the strap of his radio, the heat of their attention on him like a spotlight, and still he sat unmoved for a heartbeat. Nothing happened, just the sound of the crowd and the distant echo of a marching band, but beneath it all there was the sense of a storm forming, one that had not yet revealed itself but was inevitable, and somewhere deep inside the Marine knew that whatever was about to happen would test not only him but the people around him as well. The two guards stood over the Marine, their shadows falling across his seat as the noise of the stadium seemed to fade in the space around them. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered man with a sharp jaw and close-cropped hair, looked down at the Marine with the kind of expression that said he was used to people obeying without question. The other, slightly younger, with a leaner frame, kept glancing at the clipboard in his hand, as if it were a shield he could hide behind. The tall one spoke. First, his voice low, but with an edge that carried over the hum of the crowd. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to come with us." His words were measured, but they carried the weight of authority. The kind that did not invite discussion. The Marine did not move, his gaze still locked forward, his breathing steady like the slow rhythm of an engine that never falters. The younger guard shifted uncomfortably before adding something about a seating arrangement and a ticket mismatch. His words quick and clipped as if reciting a rehearsed line. The Marine gave no immediate answer, and that silence seemed to stretch into something heavier. The tall guard took a step closer, the sole of his shoe brushing against the toe of the Marine's boot. But the Marine still did not look at him. It was not defiance in the way most would think it was, something else. Something quieter but far more dangerous, a refusal to yield to pressure until there was a reason worth moving for. Around them, a few heads began to turn, whispers rippling among the nearest rows. A couple of older veterans sitting nearby exchanged glances, their eyes narrowing as they recognized the Marine's posture, the kind of composure that only came from years in situations where panic meant death. They knew something. The guards did not. They knew that this stillness was not submission. It was calculation. The younger guard leaned forward slightly, now holding the clipboard at his side, as he said again that the Marine needed to leave the VIP section immediately. The tall guard reached out a hand, not roughly, but with the clear intention of taking the Marine by the arm and making him stand there. Was a moment so brief it could have been missed, where the Marine's shoulders shifted just enough to center his weight, both feet planted firmly, knees slightly apart, his muscles ready under the surface, though not a single movement looked aggressive. The tall guard's hand hovered for a fraction of a second longer, as if he sensed something he could not quite name, but his pride would not let him stop. His fingers were just inches from the Marine's sleeve when the sound of a seat creaking behind them broke, the moment the tall guard turned his head and saw a man rising to his feet 3 seats down, his movement slow and deliberate, like someone who knew the value of taking his time. His eyes were locked on the guards, sharp and steady, his build lean but strong, his hair close-cropped, his face carrying the unmistakable marks of someone who had seen combat and survived it. The man said nothing, but his presence filled the space in a way that made the younger guard take a step back without realizing it. The tall guard straightened his spine as if to assert himself again, but something in the way the newcomer stood told him this was not just any bystander. This was someone who would not stand aside if things turned physical. The Marine in the seat still had not moved, his gaze still fixed forward. But there was the faintest shift at the corner of his mouth, a near invisible sign that he knew exactly what was happening and who this man was. The guards exchanged a quick glance, the younger one's brow furrowed as if trying to decide whether this was still worth pressing. The tall one tightened his jaw and gave a slight nod as if signaling they would continue. But the tension in their stance betrayed them. They had expected compliance. Now they were facing resistance, and not just from one man, but from the unspoken threat that another was ready to stand beside him. The sound of the crowd swelled again as the announcer's voice echoed across the stadium, calling out the name of another dignitary. But here in this row, the noise seemed distant, muted by the silent standoff unfolding in real time. The tall guard took another step forward, his body angled now to keep the first standing man in his peripheral vision while still focusing on the Marine in the seat, the younger. Guard shifted the clipboard to his other hand, his knuckles whitening slightly as if gripping it harder than necessary. Still, the Marine did not move, his presence anchored in that seat, like a stone in the middle of a fast river. The tall guard's voice came again, sharper this time. "Sir, I am going to have to insist," and for a heartbeat it seemed the situation would tip over the edge into something irreversible, but that was when a rustle came from the opposite side of the row, and another figure rose from his seat. The second man moved with the same quiet certainty as the first, his expression unreadable, his gaze locked on the guards, his stance equally solid. Now the guards stood facing not one, not two, but 3 men in total, all with a bearing that spoke of discipline and dangerous capability. The tall guard inhaled slowly, perhaps to steady himself. The younger guard's eyes darted from one face to another, as if silently calculating odds and realizing they were no longer favorable. The Marine's stillness had become a center point around which the entire moment balanced, and the air was so tight with tension, it seemed the very crowd noise above them could not penetrate. The announcer's voice faded into the background. The guard's breathing became audible to those close enough to hear. And though nothing violent had yet occurred, the sense of imminent action was thick and unavoidable. The Marine still had not spoken, not even a word, and yet it was clear that he was not alone, and that whatever the guards had intended would no longer happen without consequences they had not planned for. The silence between the men stretched tight as a wire, the crowd noise a far-off murmur compared to the weight of what was happening in the VIP row. The tall guard shifted his stance, his boots planted wide as if to keep his ground, but his eyes kept flicking from the Marine to the 2 men who now stood on either side of him, one 3 seats down, one across the row, each holding the kind of posture that told any trained observer they were not just ordinary men, they were something more, something disciplined and dangerous. The younger guard's Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed his grip, tightening on the clipboard. He glanced toward the aisle as if checking if more security might be nearby, but when he saw no one else approaching, his jaw tensed, his attention snapping back to the Marine and the 2 standing men. It was then that a faint sound rose from directly behind the Marine, the creak of a seat slowly being pushed back. The sound was subtle, almost lost in the crowds. Cheers. Yet in this moment it seemed louder than anything the guards had heard since arriving. A man stood up from the seat directly behind the Marine, moving with the unhurried calm of someone who did not need to prove his strength. His eyes were locked on the guards, his face weathered by time and sun, his movements controlled, deliberate, precise. He did not speak, but his presence landed like a weight in the middle of the standoff. His height was just enough to let him look slightly down on. The guards, his shoulders broad, his arms loose at his sides, but the way his feet were placed told any trained eye he could close the distance in less than a heartbeat. His gaze was cold, not in cruelty, but in clarity, the kind of clarity that came from having looked danger in the eye too many times to count and knowing exactly how to handle it. The tall guard's jaw tightened further, the muscles in his neck working as he shifted slightly, his stance less certain. Now the younger guard took an involuntary step back, his heel bumping against the seat behind him. The crowd around them was beginning to take notice. heads turning, conversations breaking off as eyes darted between the guards, the seated Marine, and the three men now standing, in silent formation around him. The Marine still did not move. He sat as if carved from stone, his breathing steady, his gaze fixed forward, ignoring the tension pressing in from all sides. Yet there was a subtle shift in the air around him, as though the space itself recognized that this was no longer a simple dispute over seating arrangements. This was becoming something else, something rooted in loyalty, in unspoken bonds, in the kind of code only a select few truly understood, one of the veterans. In the row behind the guards leaned slightly toward another, his voice barely audible over the crowd that is a wall. He said softly, and the other nodded without asking for explanation. He could see it too. These were not random men rising in defense of a stranger. These were men cut from the same cloth, brothers in arms, moving without the need for a single word. The younger guard's eyes darted toward the tall guard, a silent question in them, but the tall guard gave a small shake of his head, as if to say, not yet still convinced he could control the situation, but his confidence was wearing thin. The weight of 3 trained men watching his every move was beginning to press down harder than the noise of the stadium or the authority of his uniform. A burst of applause erupted from another section of the crowd as a famous figure walked across the field, cameras flashing in a frenzy. But here in the VIP row, the energy was different, sharper, heavier. It felt as though the space between each heartbeat was stretching. The tall guard squared his shoulders once more and took a half-step closer to the Marine, his voice low but edged with tension. "Sir, this is the last time I will ask you to leave." He said the words like a final warning. The Marine did not turn his head, but his voice came for the first time, calm, even almost quiet, yet carrying enough weight to cut through the air without effort. "I am exactly where I belong," he said. And then the silence came again, heavier than before. Because now, it was not just posture and presence. It was words, the kind that left no doubt. The 3 men standing around him shifted almost imperceptibly, their stances widening, their shoulders squaring as if to mark the moment as a line that should not be crossed. The guards felt it. They knew in some deep, unspoken place that they were no longer holding the stronger position. Their authority was suddenly fragile against the wall of silent discipline standing before them from somewhere nearby. A camera phone was raised, the small red light blinking as it began recording. Others were starting to do the same. The awareness of being watched by more than just those in the immediate row seemed to make the younger guard's breathing faster. His eyes flicking between the Marine and the 3 men, the tall guard clenched his jaw once more but said nothing. His voice caught somewhere between command and caution. In the space of a few seconds, the moment had shifted entirely what had begun, as a simple act of removal was now a test of will, and neither side seemed ready to give ground. The Marine sat calm and unshaken, the 3 men stood ready, and the guards now stood in the middle of a scene that felt far larger than the seats they occupied, the air thick with the knowledge that one wrong move could ignite the next chapter of whatever was unfolding here. The tall guard stood frozen for a breath, his eyes moving slowly from the Marine to the 3 men now standing like silent sentinels around him. His mind was working hard, weighing his next step, but every second that passed made his position weaker. The younger guard shifted his weight from one foot to the other, his eyes scanning the crowd that was slowly starting to pay closer attention to the scene. The people nearby had gone quiet, conversations fading, replaced by the low hum of tension, as they waited to see what would happen next. The Marine sat unmoving, his eyes still forward, as though the guards in front of him did not exist. Yet, his awareness filled the space around him. He could feel the weight of each man standing beside or behind him, the subtle way they held their ground, the quiet readiness in their bodies. This was not just random support. This was a shield, a living wall that needed no words to coordinate its strength. From the far end of the VIP row, a movement began, so small it might have gone unnoticed. At first, a man in a dark suit shifted forward, resting his hands on his knees before rising slowly from his seat. The motion was calm, deliberate, and unhurried. Yet, in its pace, there was something unmistakable, an intentional choice to make sure everyone watching understood he was joining the formation, without rushing, without hesitation. He straightened to his full height, taller than the others with a lean and powerful frame. His eyes locked on the guards, instantly, and did not move away. His face was unreadable, but the energy in his stance was undeniable. It carried the same signature as the others, that quiet steel that came from years of high-stakes training from missions where silence and precision decided whether you came home or not. Now 4 men stood around the Marine, each positioned with a natural spacing that seemed unplanned, yet perfect, one on each side, one directly behind one. At the far end of the row, their arrangement formed a perimeter, so subtle yet so complete that the Marine no longer seemed like a lone target, but the protected center of an unbreakable unit. The tall guard felt the shift. Instantly he glanced at the younger guard and saw in his eyes the same realization. The balance of control had tilted completely. It was no longer about a seat or a ticket. It was about something much heavier, something unwritten that every person in uniform or in the service understood. The younger guard took a small step back without being told. His instincts telling him this was no longer a confrontation. They could win without consequences, far beyond the stadium walls. Around them, the crowd had grown more attentive. A few phones were held up discreetly, trying to capture the moment, though none of them could capture the weight in the air. The kind of weight that pressed into the chest and made it hard to breathe. The people close enough to see the faces of the men understood. There was history here, bonds that could not be explained to an outsider. The Marine still had not moved. But there was something in the set of his shoulders now, a quiet acknowledgement of the men who had risen without needing to be asked his brothers in a language that did not use words. The 4th man at the end of the row adjusted his stance slightly, just enough to close a gap between himself and the Marine. The 3 others did the same, each small movement fitting into the larger unspoken pattern. The tall guard drew in a deep breath, as if trying to summon back the authority he felt slipping from him. But every time his eyes met those of the men standing, he found no fear there, no aggression, either just a certainty that said they would not move, and they would not allow him to move. The Marine! The younger guard shifted his grip on the clipboard, his knuckles pale as he tried to think of something to say, but his voice caught before he could form the words. The announcer's voice echoed over the loudspeakers, calling out another name somewhere across the field. The crowd erupted in applause, but in this row the sound was distant, hollow. The people here were caught in the gravity of a different moment, one unfolding in slow, deliberate beats, each one louder in its silence than the cheers of thousands. The tall guard finally spoke, his voice lower than before. Perhaps so others would not hear. Perhaps because the weight of the moment pressed it down. "Sir, you need to understand," he began, but he stopped mid-sentence. When the 4th man took one step forward, it was not fast. It was not threatening, but it was final. A clear, unshakable signal that there would be no negotiation. Here the tall guard swallowed hard, feeling the eyes of all 4 men locked on him. The younger guard's foot shifted again back toward the aisle, an unconscious retreat. The Marine still sat with that same calm, his gaze never once meeting the guards. Yet somehow he was the center of every decision being made in that moment. The 4th man eased his shoulders back slightly as though settling into his position for as long as it might take, and the others followed suit. The unity in their movements spoke louder than any words could. The tall guard's mouth opened as if to try one last attempt, but the weight of the 4 men's presence kept the words trapped somewhere in his throat. The younger guard looked at him and gave the smallest shake of his head. Not in defiance, but in silent agreement that this needed to end now before something irreversible happened. The tall guard exhaled a long, slow breath, the kind that came when a fight was no longer worth the cost. The tension in the air was like a heavy blanket pressing down on every soul within the VIP row. It was as if the stadium noise had faded into a distant hum, replaced by the pounding of hearts and the tightening of throats. The guards still stood, frozen in place, unsure of how to proceed, while the Marine remained as unmoving as a statue, his eyes fixed somewhere beyond the field, his posture straight, his presence unshaken. From the other side of the row, another man rose slowly, his movement deliberate, measured, as if every inch upward was a statement of intent. He wore a simple civilian jacket, but there was something in his posture that betrayed years of discipline. His shoulders broad, his eyes sharp, scanning the faces of the guards. With the precision of a predator measuring its prey, there was no rush in his movement, no wasted energy. Every step, every breath was controlled. The second SEAL did not speak. His eyes alone communicated everything that needed to be said. He moved. One step closer, his presence now, an undeniable barrier between the guards and the Marine. The first guard, who had been ready to grab the Marine's arm, now hesitated, his hand hanging in the air, unsure whether to retreat or continue forward. His partner shifted uncomfortably, glancing at the rising man, and then back at the Marine as if weighing the risks. The crowd around them sensed the change in the atmosphere, though most did not understand its source. A few whispered to each other, leaning in as if afraid to speak too loudly. Others sat still, afraid that any sudden movement might shatter the strange, fragile balance that had formed in front of them. The field below was alive with action, but here in this row, a silent battle of wills had begun, and it was drawing all attention. The second SEAL took another step, his boots silent on the carpeted floor, his gaze unwavering. He did not need to flex his muscles or raise his voice. His calm was more dangerous than any display of aggression could ever be. It told the guards that he was ready, that he had stood in darker places than this and come out alive. It told them that this was not a man they could intimidate with authority or procedure. The first guard finally lowered his hand, letting it fall slowly to his side, but he did not move away. Instead, he squared his shoulders as if trying to regain the dominance he felt, slipping through his fingers. The second guard remained tense, his jaw tight, his fingers gripping the clipboard. A little too hard, the papers inside bending under the strain. The Marine remained motionless, but there was a subtle change in the air around him, as if he too recognized the presence at his side as a shield. The faintest flicker of acknowledgement passed through his eyes, not a smile, not even a nod, but a recognition of shared understanding. The second SEAL caught it, and in that wordless exchange, something solidified, something unshakable. The guards exchanged a glance, each searching for an answer in the other's face, but neither found it. They were trained for confrontation. Yes, but not for this. Not for men who stood without fear, without anger, and yet without yielding. There was no shouting, no threats, no physical resistance, and yet the message was clear as day. The Marine was not moving, and now he was not alone. One of the spectators, 2 rows back, leaned forward, trying to get a better view. His phone slipping into his hand almost instinctively, but a quick glance from the second SEAL was enough to make him think twice. He pocketed the phone again without unlocking it, his curiosity replaced by an uneasy respect for whatever was unfolding. The first guard shifted his weight, then took a step back only to stop himself as if afraid that retreat would mark defeat. He glanced over at his partner, hoping for some unspoken cue, but received none. The second SEAL continued to stand close, his breathing steady, his eyes never breaking contact with the men in uniform. Every second that passed seemed longer than the last. The noise from the crowd rose and fell in waves, But here in the VIP row, the only sounds were the faint rustle of clothing and the distant hum of the announcer's voice over the speakers. The second SEAL's calm was infectious and yet intimidating. It was the calm of someone who could act in a heartbeat if provoked. It was in this stillness that the guards began to realize the depth of the challenge before them. It was no longer about a seat or a rule or a name on a clipboard. This was about presence, about unspoken lines that they had crossed without knowing it. The second SEAL did not need to tell them what would happen if they pushed further. His mere existence here was enough. The Marine still had not moved. His hands rested on his knees, his gaze steady and unblinking, as if the drama beside him did not exist, or perhaps as if it was exactly what he expected to happen. The second SEAL stood tall beside him, his posture unyielding his body, angled slightly forward in a stance that said without words, "You will not take him." And so the silent war stretched on each side, waiting for the other to make the next move, yet deep down, perhaps both sides knew how this was going to end. The guards had been sent to enforce an order, but they had stumbled into a situation far beyond that, into a territory where their authority meant less than the weight of the men standing before them. The second SEAL did not waver. Not for a moment. He was not there to negotiate. Not there to explain. He was there for one purpose, only to ensure the Marine stayed exactly where he was, and with each breath that purpose became more unshakable. The guards could feel it, the crowd could sense it, and the Marine could trust it. The guards were not defeated yet, but they were no longer in control, and that truth hung in the air between them like a storm waiting to break. The tension in the air was thick enough to slow every movement in the VIP row, as the third SEAL now stood directly behind the Marine, his tall frame blocking out the light from the aisle. The spectators sitting nearby had gone almost completely silent, their eyes darting between the guards and the man who had risen without hesitation. There was no grand announcement, no declaration of intent, only a presence that spoke louder than anything words could achieve. The third SEAL was like a wall, immovable, unshakable, and completely focused on the men standing in front of the Marine. The guards felt it instantly, that strange shift in the balance of power that made the ground under their feet seem unsteady. One of them adjusted his grip on the clipboard, his knuckles turning white while the other swallowed hard, trying to maintain the rigid stance of authority they had walked in with. But the truth was now pressing against them like a tide that refused to stop rising. They were no longer in control of the moment, and the more they looked into the calm, steady eyes of the men now standing before them, the more they felt it slipping away. The crowd may not have known every detail, but some faces in the VIP section recognized exactly what they were seeing: the posture, the stillness, the way these men measured every inch of space between themselves and the perceived threat. These were not ordinary spectators. They were warriors, and not just any warriors, but those trained to handle the kind of pressure that could crush others without warning one wrong move, and this could turn into something the guards were not prepared for. The third SEAL did not glance at. The Marine did not need to, because there was no question about where his loyalty stood. His gaze was locked on the guard who had been the first to lean in toward the Marine. Earlier there was no aggression in it, but there was no yielding either. It was the kind of look that carried the weight of 1,000 battles, silently reminding the other man that he was standing in territory he should never have stepped into. One row back, a man in a tailored suit whispered to the woman beside him, his voice barely audible even to her alone. Yet she nodded slowly, understanding that what they were witnessing was not about a seat or a rule being enforced. It was about something deeper, about respect, about unspoken codes between those who have served and those who have earned a place through more than tickets or titles. The Marine had not moved, his head still tilted slightly, his hands still resting loosely on his knees, but the scene unfolding around him was now entirely different than the one from moments before. The guards exchanged a glance, and in that flicker, of connection, There was uncertainty, the kind that grows when logic meets instinct and instinct begins to scream that the situation is beyond your control. One of them cleared his throat, shifting his weight from one foot to the other as if trying to re-establish some footing, but the atmosphere made it impossible. The third SEAL stood tall, his presence absorbing the space like a shadow that refused to move. Somewhere in the upper levels of the stadium, the game announcer called out a score. The crowd erupted briefly, but even that energy seemed to break around the pocket of stillness here, like waves splitting around a stone. The Marine remained unmoved, yet everything about the air suggested that this was his space now, and anyone who tried to take it would have to step through the men who stood guard without needing to be asked. The two guards were trained for many situations to deal with unruly guests, to calm disputes, to enforce rules without escalating. But this was different. This was an encounter they could not frame in their manual because their opponents did not act like challengers. They acted like sentinels, each one rising without a word, but with an intent that could not be mistaken. The third SEAL had arrived, at his post as naturally as breathing, and his quiet was not passive. It was watchful. One of the spectators shifted uncomfortably, and the sound of the seat creaking seemed almost too loud in the hush. The guards heard it too, and for a moment, it reminded them that eyes were everywhere, that whatever decision they made next would be witnessed by more than just the four men in front of them and the Marine in the chair. They began to realize that there was no easy path forward here. Stepping back might be seen as a retreat, but stepping forward might be a mistake they could never undo. The Marine had not asked for help, had not spoken a single word since they approached. Yet help had arrived without hesitation, without discussion, without any visible signal, as though these men had simply felt the need and answered it. And now with three of them surrounding him, the balance of this confrontation had shifted so completely that the guards could feel the weight of it in their bones. Their authority no longer felt solid, it felt paper-thin. In that moment, something subtle happened. The third SEAL shifted his stance just slightly, planting his feet wider, his hands loose at his sides but ready. The move was so small that most would have missed it. Yet to the guards, it was unmistakable. It was the language of readiness, and it carried an unspoken message, one that told them that whatever they thought was going to happen here would not happen the way they planned. The guards hesitated again, and, in the silence between breaths, the entire section seemed to lean forward, waiting to see what would come next. It was a silence that could stretch for hours in the minds of those standing at its center. The murmurs in the crowd spread like ripples in a pond, each voice low and unsure, each face turning toward the sudden and silent display unfolding in the VIP row. The third man, now standing behind the Marine, was like a dark tower, his shadow stretching. Over the seated figure, his frame broad, his posture immovable, his gaze fixed forward as if scanning an invisible horizon. The tension between the guards and the line of men was thick enough to slow the air itself. The guards shifted uneasily, their shoes scraping against the carpeted floor, their shoulders tightening with each second that passed. The Marine had not spoken, had not moved. His hands remained steady on his knees. Yet the presence of the man behind him changed everything. Spectators leaned forward slightly, unable to tear their eyes from the scene. Yet still trying not to be noticed, a man in the next row down whispered something to his companion, who quickly shook his head as if warning him not to get involved. An older veteran, with a faded cap, clenched his jaw, his eyes narrowing with recognition, because he knew the stance. He knew the discipline. He knew what it meant for a man to stand like that without a word, and without fear. The guards, however, did not seem to understand the weight of what was in front of them, or perhaps they did but were too deep into their role to step away. Now, the third man behind the Marine did not glance at the guards, nor did he acknowledge the growing curiosity of the crowd. Instead, his eyes moved slowly across the venue, scanning upper levels, the entry points, the exits, each shift of his gaze calculated as if he was expecting something more than a simple confrontation. His silence was louder than any raised voice. It was the silence of someone who had been in places where a single word could mean the difference between life and death. The guards glanced at each other, their earlier authority now blending with hesitation, their breaths shorter, their shoulders squared, but with less conviction than before. The Marine sat like a stone, unshaken by the growing wall of support around him, and yet there was a subtle shift in his breathing, as if he too felt the tide turning in his favor, though he gave no outward sign to confirm. One of the guards tried to reassert control, stepping forward half a pace and opening his mouth to speak, but before any sound could leave his lips, the man behind the Marine moved not a full step, just enough to change the air around them, his weight shifting slightly onto the balls of his feet, his hands relaxed but ready. The guard froze mid-word, his jaw tightening before he slowly closed his mouth again. There was a strange quiet in the VIP row now, as if the noise of the stadium had been pulled into the background. The cheer of the crowd elsewhere felt distant, irrelevant, compared to the charged moment unfolding here. Every face nearby seemed locked on them. Every heartbeat quickened every second slower than the last. The man behind the Marine did not blink for what felt like a full minute. His focus cutting through the space like a blade, the guards found themselves looking away from his eyes, unable to hold his gaze for more than a breath. And then, as if on cue, the Marine's head tilted slightly back, not toward the guards, but toward the man standing behind him. It was almost imperceptible, but it carried weight. It was the kind of movement soldiers understood without words. A silent acknowledgement, a silent order, or perhaps a silent thanks. The man behind him gave no visible response yet. Something in the way he shifted his stance suggested that message had been received clearly. The guards began to realize that their usual tactics, their uniforms, their sense of authority, carried little weight here. They were used to controlling situations with presence and tone, but these men carried a different kind of authority, one that came from places no badge or clipboard could touch, one that could not be learned in a seminar, or taught through policy, one that was earned in shadows and silence. In the rows behind them, a woman in a dark coat reached for her phone, her fingers trembling slightly as she tried to record without being seen. Others glanced nervously toward the nearest security cameras, unsure of whether they were capturing this scene, and unsure of whether they wanted it to be seen at all. The third man's stillness was unnerving, because it was not the stillness of indecision, but of preparation. The guards could sense it now, a quiet readiness that could explode into motion at the first wrong move. One of the guards swallowed hard, his Adam's apple rising sharply. He glanced toward the nearest exit as if calculating whether leaving would be worse than staying. The other guard gave a small shake of his head as if silently telling him to hold his ground, though even that gesture lacked the conviction it carried before the crowd's murmurs were growing now, some with admiration, some with unease, and some with the strange thrill of knowing they were witnessing something that was not supposed to happen in a place like this. The Marine still had not spoken, still had not moved his hands from his knees, yet the power in the row was clearly no. Longer in the hands of the guards, it had shifted behind him and was growing with each second, as if invisible lines were being drawn in the air around them. The third man remained where he was, a silent barrier, a presence that said without words, "You will not move him. You will not touch him. Not here, not now." The guards stood in place, but they knew in the quiet part of their minds that they were already losing the battle, and they could feel that loss settling heavy on their shoulders. The fourth SEAL at the far end of the row rose in deliberate silence, his movement so unhurried it drew every set of eyes in the surrounding seats. His frame was broad and commanding, the kind that suggested years of carrying gear far heavier than most men could lift. He stood tall, shoulders squared, his boots planted firmly on the concrete as though he had anchored himself to the very earth. His gaze locked on the two guards with an intensity that made them pause, mid-breath. The guards shifted. Uneasily, as the realization began to sink in, they were no longer in control of this moment. The fourth SEAL did not break eye contact as he stepped out into the aisle. His movements smooth and calculated, his jaw set in a way that carried the weight of both discipline and danger. The energy in the VIP section shifted, the chatter from the crowd tapered off into a tense hush. The air seemed thicker, heavier, every heartbeat feeling like it echoed through the space. The Marine still sat unmoving, his back straight, his focus forward, but there was a subtle change in his posture now, a faint ease in his shoulders, as though he knew he was no longer alone. The first SEAL remained a few steps to his left, standing firm and silent. The second was positioned on the opposite side, equally still and unwavering. The third, directly behind the Marine, had not moved an inch. His eyes shadowed by the brim of his cap, his stance like a wall of steel. Now with the fourth SEAL joining them, it was as if the Marine was encased in an unbreakable formation. The guards took a step back, but not out of retreat, rather a desperate attempt to recalculate their approach. One of them tried to force a smile, perhaps to diffuse the mounting tension, but the expression looked forced and brittle. His hand brushed at the radio clipped to his belt. His partner caught the movement and gave a small shake of the head, a warning that this was not a situation that would be solved by calling for backup. The silent pressure from the four SEALs was more potent than any verbal threat, the kind of unspoken warning that came from men who had operated in the most dangerous corners of the world where hesitation could cost lives. Around them, spectators pretended to look elsewhere, but every eye was stealing glances. The shift in energy was impossible to ignore. Parents pulled their children a little closer. Some leaned in, whispering to companions, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Yet none dared speak loudly for fear of drawing attention. The stadium noise beyond the VIP section still roared with the excitement of the event, but here it felt as if the sound had been dimmed, muffled under the weight of what was unfolding. The fourth SEAL took a slow step forward. Closing the space between himself and the guards, his boots made a muted thud against the floor, each step echoing with intent. There was no aggression in his body language yet, no softness either. It was a controlled power, a mastery of presence that only those who had seen combat could truly understand. He stopped just close enough for the guards to feel the heat of his gaze. One of them swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing visibly under the strain of holding himself together. The other shifted his stance, trying to appear unbothered, but his hands betrayed him, his fingers twitching at his sides. No words were spoken, yet an entire conversation was taking place in the locked eyes between the SEALs and the guards. The message was unmistakable. The Marine was not moving. The Marine was not to be touched, and any attempt otherwise would not end well. The Marine himself remained perfectly still, but in the set of his jaw and the faint narrowing of his eyes, there was acknowledgement. He knew exactly what these men were doing for him, and he also knew why. The seconds stretched, each one heavier than the last. The crowd in this section seemed caught in a collective breath, waiting to see who would move first. The guards glanced at one another. For the briefest moment, and in that flicker of uncertainty, their authority cracked. The fourth SEAL shifted his weight slightly, not aggressively, but enough to draw their focus back to him. His hands hung loosely by his sides, but every muscle was primed, every tendon ready to respond if needed. From somewhere, a gust of air swept through the aisle, carrying with it the distant scent of food from the concession stands. But here it was. Barely noticed, the tension drowned out every other sense. The fourth SEAL finally inclined his head just slightly toward the guards, a movement so subtle it might have been mistaken for nothing, but the meaning behind it was clear. This was not their ground to claim, not today, not ever. The guards' faces hardened, but their eyes told the truth. They knew this was a line they could not cross. The first guard's lips parted as if to say something, but no words came. He closed his mouth and looked away, breaking eye contact, a choice that sealed the outcome. The second guard's shoulders slumped ever so slightly, as if the weight of the moment had finally pressed down on him. The four SEALs remained silent, their formation unbroken, their bodies still except for the occasional shift of breath the Marines. Presence in the center of it all radiated an unspoken pride, one that needed no explanation to those who understood loyalty and brotherhood. When the guards finally stepped back, the movement was slow, deliberate, almost as if they feared turning their backs entirely. They retreated down the aisle, vanishing into the shadows of the crowd without a single glance behind them. The fourth SEAL held his position for a moment longer, watching until they were gone, before returning to his seat, his steps, as measured as when he had risen. The others followed suit, each settling back into place, the air slowly beginning to loosen around them. But the moment would not fade from memory. The Marine gave the faintest nod, his eyes still forward, his body steady and unshaken, and though the crowd began to breathe again, the image of four silent SEALs rising in unity would remain etched into the minds of those who had witnessed it. The guards stood frozen in place, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a heavy stone, their eyes darting between each of the four men who now stood like unshakable pillars around the Black Marine. The air in the VIP row seemed to grow thicker, heavier each breath, carrying the silent knowledge that something was happening here, something that could not be undone. The crowd behind them shifted in their seats, sensing without understanding the magnitude of what they were witnessing. Yet no one dared speak. No one dared even cough in the presence of this raw, unspoken defiance. The first guard's hand twitched as if he might still try to assert himself, but the subtle shake of his partner's head told him what he already knew. This was not going to end with him being in control. The four SEALs did not speak. Their silence was its own weapon, their bodies angled in a way that created an invisible wall, an unbreakable barrier between the Marine and the men who sought to move. Each of them radiated a calm, unshakable confidence. The kind of calm that only came from years of standing in dangerous places and refusing to back down. The guards could feel it in their bones, the strange, heavy awareness that they were not simply facing ordinary spectators. They were facing men who had lived on the edge of death and come back stronger. A single bead of sweat rolled down the first guard's temple, his jaw tightening as the crowd began to murmur, the whispers spreading like a slow ripple across a still lake. People leaning toward each other, straining to catch any fragment of what was going on. But the SEALs gave them nothing. No words, no raised voices, just the kind of presence that demanded attention and respect. Without ever asking for it, the Marine remained seated as still as a statue, his hands resting loosely on his knees, his gaze fixed straight ahead as though the guards were no more than passing shadows. The second guard shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing toward the aisle where a few higher-ranking event staff now stood at a distance watching the scene unfold, their expressions a mix of uncertainty and fear. The guards had been trained to handle disruptive guests. They had been trained to enforce rules, but no training manual covered what to do when four of the most elite warriors in the world rose in perfect silent unity to protect one man from being moved. The taller SEAL on the left side of the row took a single step forward, and that was all it took. The guards instinctively stepped back, their eyes never leaving his face. His expression was not aggressive, not openly hostile, but there was something in his gaze, something cold and sharp that carried a promise. A promise that if the guards made the wrong move, there would be consequences, swift and absolute. Time seemed to stretch the sounds of the stadium far away, the distant roar of the crowd for the main event barely reaching their ears. The guards, breathing loud in their own heads, each heartbeat a reminder that they were standing on the edge of something they could not control. The first guard glanced again at the Marine, wondering what made him so important, what connection he had to these men, why they would stand like this for him without hesitation. But deep down, he already knew the answer. It was loyalty. The kind that could not be broken by rules or uniforms, the kind forged in places where the only thing standing between you and death was the man beside you. One of the seals near the end of the row shifted slightly enough to block more of the Marine from view, and the movement carried the quiet finality of a door closing. A door the guards would not be allowed to open. The second guard exhaled a slow breath, his shoulders sagging as if the fight had drained out of him. He looked at his partner, and without a single word, both men began to step back, retreating down the narrow aisle, each step feeling heavier than the last. The murmurs in the crowd swelled, a few people exchanging knowing looks, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The higher-ranking staff at the aisle exchanged quick glances before disappearing into the corridor beyond, none of them willing to involve themselves in whatever. This was the guards' retreat did not bring celebration from the four seals. They simply watched the men go their stances, never breaking their eyes, tracking every movement until the guards vanished from sight only. Then did the seals slowly return to their seats, their movements calm, deliberate, unhurried. The Marine gave the faintest nod, a gesture so small most would have missed it. Yet each seal saw it and understood it was not thanks, it was acknowledgement. An unspoken message between warriors who did not need to waste breath on words. The air in the VIP row began to ease, the tension fading, though the people who had witnessed it would not forget what they had seen, somewhere far above the national flag hung unmoving, its colors vivid under the stadium lights. As though watching over the quiet storm that had just passed, the Marine remained seated, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable. But in that stillness was the presence of someone who had been tested time and time again and had never broken. The four seals sat around him, their eyes occasionally sweeping the crowd, the message clear and unshakable. This was not a man who stood alone. Those who saw it that day would remember the silence more than anything. The silence that spoke louder than any confrontation, could the kind of silence that carried weight and history and unbreakable bonds. And though no one in the crowd would ever speak openly about what had happened, the memory would live on in the minds of those who had been there, the image of two guards backing away and four warriors standing tall in perfect unity, guarding one of their own, as if the world itself could not touch him.